Welcome to yet another in the series of Perth U.S. Asia Center Foreign Policy Conversations. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by a friend from the farthest reaches of the globe, away from Perth in Washington, D.C., Ambassador Wendy Cutler. I think many of you know Wendy. She's been in Perth in the past. She joined us in 2017 for the kickoff of our now fourth in a series of Japan symposiums. She currently serves as Vice President and Managing Director of the Washington, D.C. office of the Asia Society Policy Institute. But prior to that, had a distinguished 30-year career in U.S. diplomacy and trade, mostly with the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, culminating as the Acting Deputy Trade Representative. And from my perspective, in 30 years in Washington working on Korea as the Assistant Secretary, or the Assistant U.S. Trade Representative rather, for Japan, Korea, and APEC. Somebody we turn to on all matters economic and trade in the region for a long time. Wendy, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Well, thank you, Gordon. It's really my pleasure.
And as we mentioned before clicking on record here, we're keen to entice you back to Western Australia, but these days we're not even letting Australians back in, so that might be a ways off before we can get to that soon. But first on the list coming back in for sure.
I look forward to that day, but in the meantime, you know, the video approach seems to be the best.
Well, thanks for that. When you were here 4 years ago, we were at the start of the Trump administration. There was a lot of anxiety about America's approach to the region, whether or not the U.S. was going to kind of continue with the focus on the region. And the U.S. at that time had just begun to adopt a phrase that the Australians hold dear to our hearts, which is kind of the Indo-Pacific, an Indo-Pacific strategy. There has been, as you might imagine, some considerable sense of relief with a more traditional return to U.S. foreign policy in Washington, D.C. under the Biden administration, but we're now kind of 6 months into the administration. I wonder if you might just give us your overview from your perch in Washington of the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific policy approach, priorities, with a particular focus on economic policy.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Gordon. And you're right. We're 6 months into the Biden administration. And I know for people overseas, that seems like a long time. But in reality, in Washington, it takes time to kind of get all the personnel in place and to get things up and running. And let's also remember the president was left with a very heavy and important domestic agenda, which has required a lot of his focus. But nevertheless, and I think what's so, even to me, surprising as how quickly the administration has re-engaged in the world, including in the Indo-Pacific, while working on COVID recovery, economic recovery, and rebuilding our competitiveness. So I think we've shown the world that we're back. I've also think that through the Quad Leaders Summit, through the visit of Prime Minister Suga, President Moon to the United States, through the G7 meetings and other meetings, the administration has been very active and also has made it clear that the Indo-Pacific is going to be a priority area of focus.
You spent much of your career helping write the rules of the road for economic interaction among nations, particularly in this region. We have seen over the last year in Australia some real abrogation of those rules in the form of politically linked economic coercion of Australia, primarily from our largest trade partner in China. It's been interesting for me and probably enheartening to many of my colleagues here in Australia to see the Biden administration come out quite quickly condemning that economic coercion. I think Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, stated that the U.S. would stand shoulder to shoulder with Australia. The Indo-Pacific Czar, our mutual friend Kurt Campbell, made it clear that the pathway to improving the U.S.-China relations kind of went through Australia, that we couldn't improve unless there was some cessation of the economic coercion on Australia. Can you give us your thoughts on what's happened to Australia over the last year and put that in the context of your long work in the trade space?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have watched with great concern in Washington Chinese actions against Australia, a very strong ally of ours. But I think, as you mentioned, we're not just watching. This administration has been out there kind of calling China out. I think what is, where they may be somewhat vulnerable to criticism is that in terms of concrete measures, like what are we doing here? How are we working together to make sure China doesn't get away with this, or this doesn't become kind of a model for future countries in terms of China's relationship or future attempts for economic coercion. And there, I would like to think that I was one of the first people out in front of this issue, because as a trade person, just when I started reading about what China was doing, particularly given that Australia and China have a free trade agreement, and here we had China product after product holding up Australian imports at the border. So what I called for then was really working with Australia and other countries in the WTO and call China out on these practices. This is not acceptable. This is not in line with WTO rules. And so I think we should be doing that in the WTO. I also note that Australia has lodged formal dispute settlement complaints against China in the WTO. And I think the United States should be supporting those proceedings. Now that might lead you to the next question. Well, isn't the US blocking the WTO dispute settlement mechanism? But I'm sure we'll get back to that question. But I think we've done a lot. Maybe there is some frustration that maybe it's more words than actions. But my view is we need to think practically here. I know there are a lot of ideas out there, maybe for like a NATO for economic coercion, or some kind of reserve fund where countries that are under economic coercion would be given money from this fund. I'm a little skeptical in terms of how how these types of mechanisms would work. I think we need to be practical. And I also think that we need to understand what would be helpful to Australia as it tries to navigate through this very uncomfortable situation.
So you referenced the WTO, and that is a wonderful segue to the next question, because there was considerable anxiety here in Australia, a country that kind of uses rules-based order as a mantra and sees international organizations like the WTO as important, despite their weaknesses. There have been some real problems in the WTO, even prior to the Trump administration. Obviously, you referenced one of the most specific problems is the appellate body within the WTO and the roadblock in kind of getting new judges appointed to that process. Can you give us your sense for the WTO now and what needs to happen and what maybe Australia and the US need to do together in that front? Because you're correct. Australia has lodged at least one formal complaint to the WTO.
I think it's two.
Barley. It's two now.
Barley and wine. Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
And obviously, for those to be successful, there does need to be some change. Could you give a sense for what we need to be doing in that front?
Yeah, so let me just talk, first a bit more broadly about the WTO. I mean, it's clearly in trouble, and its problems have been mounting over the years. They didn't start with the Trump administration, but I think the Trump administration was pretty skeptical of all multilateral organizations, and the WTO kind of fit, within that model. And so, but now I think, we're looking at a number of developments, which I think could present an opportunity for the WTO to kind of turn around its fate. Number one, we have the appointment of a new director general, Dr. Ngozi. She's incredibly energetic and is really trying to shake up the organization and get stuff done. Second, we have the upcoming ministerial meeting of the WTO in November. And third, the United States now has made it very clear that multilateralism is back in vogue, and we're going to be constructive. And I would just say over the past 24 hours, we just joined the plurilateral negotiation on services domestic regulation. I wouldn't say that's, like a major step, but I think it's indicative of the US commitment to the WTO. But I also worry because I think if the WTO can't produce results, then US and other interests may, dissipate in the short term. So in my view, this is kind of a make or break it year for the WTO. And I sincerely hope that, lead up to the coming out of the November ministerial, we can all turn to some concrete achievements. Just briefly on dispute settlement, I think that was your question. That again was a problem that was building up over time, U.S. frustration with the operation of the appellate body. What I hope is that the United States, instead of kind of sitting on the sidelines and saying that this system is broken, we're not sure how to fix it, that the U.S. comes forward with concrete ideas and we actually have a real negotiation and work on practical and systemic fixes that would address not only our concerns, but concerns of other countries as well. Because I think a functional dispute settlement system, like you mentioned, it's so important for everyone, but particularly for middle-sized countries like Australia.
So would the United States view Australia as a natural partner in pursuing reforms of the WTO, or in pursuing kind of—
Absolutely. I mean, again, I think you used the phrase earlier, shoulder to shoulder. I think, yes, we are shoulder to shoulder with respect to WTO reform. We should work very closely with a lot of overlapping interest, including just in the general desire for an effective rules-based system. And so I think there are many issues we can work on. I know we're working closely, for example, on the e-commerce negotiations, which is being jointly led by Australia, Singapore, and Japan, but in other areas as well. So I think our partnership is critical to kind of turning around this organization and making it effective and relevant, frankly, for the challenges the trading system's facing now.
Now, on a bilateral level, you were the lead negotiator on the Korea-U.S. free trade agreement in the mid-2000s, probably one of the highest quality free trade agreements the United States has ever signed. You also did a number of issue-specific and sector-specific negotiations, Japan, et cetera, but all of that kind of culminated in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was something, it was not quite WTO multilateral, but whether you call it mini-lateral or regional or whatever, it really kind of was a focus of a good chunk of your career. The U.S. is not in the TPP. Japan and Australia did something which I think has gotten far too little attention, which was this almost miraculous resurrection of the TPP after the U.S. withdrew, in the form of the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the CPTPP, which I struggle to say 5 times fast.
We all do.
But one way or the other, U.S. credibility in the trade realm would seem to require, at least from my view here in the region, some U.S. reconciliation with your previous work with the TPP. Can you give us a sense? I realize you said at the outset that we're only 6 months in the administration and their priority has been COVID. And I do understand the sensitivities around trade at this point, but I think we're looking for some sense of U.S. direction on the trade architecture in the Indo-Pacific.
Yeah, that's a great question. And a lot of my friends in the region ask, are we going to come back? When might we come back? And frankly, my answer is kind of not what folks want to hear. I don't see us in the near term coming back to the CPTPP. And if in the medium term we were to consider it, I think the United States would need to seek some major revisions to the agreement. There was the TPP in many respects, was groundbreaking at the time. The negotiation took about 5 years to complete. And during those years, U.S. sentiment on trade really changed. And that culminated in the trade policies, I think, of President Trump. And so this notion that we would just go back to something that just didn't work for us politically at home, I just don't see that happening. But that said, I am a huge advocate of the United States needing to find a way to get back in the Indo-Pacific region in the trade space, because without trade initiatives in the region, I think our engagement will be viewed as incomplete in the Indo-Pacific. And we're already seeing not only the CPT, but RCEP and other bilaterals where the United States is on the sidelines. So we need to get back in the trade game. And I think a much more realistic approach is not to go for a comprehensive agreement that covers, 25 different subject areas, but focus on kind of a narrower sectoral negotiations, which could serve as building blocks over time towards a larger agreement, but could also tackle some big and emerging issues that are affecting the region, where the United States should be working with Australia and others to shape the rules of the road going forward.
So on that, I understand there has been some progress on a digital trade pact, which is what you're speaking about, something a little bit more narrow. But before we go there, I wonder if I might push back a little bit. And I'm sitting again at the farthest point in the planet on land away from Washington, D.C. But it strikes me that political leaders in Washington might be a little bit behind where the U.S. public is on this issue. There is this long-standing mantra that even Hillary Clinton opposed the TPP in the 2016 election, and the U.S. electorate has moved beyond that. But consistently, over the course of the Trump administration, public polling showed increasing American support for free trade and even increasing support for the TPP. And part of that was just driven by the fact that perhaps President Trump was so over the top in his nativism that he made it safe for people on the progressive side of the political spectrum in the United States to support TPP or free trade in general. And so I'm just kind of wondering whether or not those long-standing assumptions that politics won't bear it, the American public won't bear it, the support is not there, have actually even been tested, or whether we're just too busy to even think about that, or is there a lack of courage, if you will, on the political side?
Well, I think what we're seeing, particularly in the U.S. Congress, which would have to approve these types of trade agreements like the TPP, there's a real shift going on in the Republican Party on trade, as well as in the Democratic Party. I mean, when Trade Promotion Authority was passed in 2015, it was largely passed due to a strong Republican majority. And I think when you look at the Republican Party now, which used to be the pro-business, the pro-free trade party, I don't think you can count on them to deliver any trade agreement. So therefore, and what kind of the USMCA showed, it's trying to bring on more Democrats to support these agreements. And under USMCA, to get that Democratic support, new provisions were added into the USMCA, which are not in TPP, concerning strict rules of origin, strong labor enforcement mechanisms, stronger environmental mechanisms. So this is what I was kind of referring to earlier. If we were going to come back to the TPP, I think we would need to see some major changes, and some of them, I think, would have their origins in what we agreed to in the USMCA.
Well, that's sobering, but useful to understand. So let's move back to a little bit more positive territory. There does seem to have been some movement on a digital trade pact, and obviously this is something that Australia is very much focused on as well. Could you give a sense for, obviously absent any short-term movement on the CPTPP, what's happening on that space, and whether that represents what you were talking about, something that where we can have a presence or make some progress absent a broad-based agreement?
Well, again, I think there is a recognition in Washington that to really be engaged and lead in the Indo-Pacific, we need to have a trade agenda, and we need to put forward some trade initiatives which are rules-based and market opening. And so, in my view, a digital economy agreement is kind of a low-hanging fruit compared to other issues. And why do I say that? Part of it is because Australia has been so active, along with Singapore and New Zealand and Japan in the region, concluding their own deals in this area. But moreover, we've just, digital trade is encompassing more and more of actual trade, affecting not only services companies, but manufacturing companies, and not just the big data firms. If anything, I think a digital trade deal would really help small and medium-sized enterprises which can benefit from use of digital tools in order to trade in the international marketplace. I also think that a digital trade agreement can promote digital inclusiveness. We could set up cooperative mechanisms for working on technologies of the future and standards of the future. So when I look at kind of, when I talk about a digital trade or a digital economy agreement, for me, it means more than just kind of, you know, the disciplines we saw in the TPP on e-commerce, but really broader than that, and allowing also for what I would call soft obligations, where we could work together in shaping the rules going forward. Because again, I think for the United States, being on the sidelines, particularly in the technology space, when other countries are setting the rules, is going to be something that we're going to, you know, we will regret in the future. But I just want to emphasize that, you know, there's a lot of talk in Washington now about developing a worker-centered trade policy and a trade policy that works for the middle class. And I applaud that approach. But I think when you look at deals like a digital economy agreement, I think it could offer a lot of benefits for small and medium-sized enterprises, for our citizens, and for our middle class, not just in the United States, but all over the world. And I think that's important going forward.
So can you give us a sense for the prospects or the time frame for an agreement on that? Is that also years away, or is that something that's
I hope not. I hope not, because, you know, in my view, the whole point of turning to this issue, and for me personally, to be, you know, to be you know, talking and writing about this issue, is that this is something we could do in the near term. But I'm not privy to the internal discussions. And again, you know, it's going to, I think, take a little time for the administration to figure out what they want to do on trade going forward. So I'm hopeful. And I know there are folks in the administration who, you know, clearly recognize the need to move quickly on trade in the region, but they're going to need to sort things out, you know, among the different agencies.
Well, Wendy, as you know, Australia as a country, and our state of Western Australia in particular, are deeply dependent on trade. And so someone like yourself who spent so much time focusing on the architecture and the rules of the road, your insights are deeply valuable to us, to our broader community. We thank you for making the time to chat with us this morning. I would note that last month we were fortunate to host the Australian Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, on his way to the G7. He gave a very far-reaching foreign policy speech. And in response to that, your colleague at the Asia Society Policy Institute, Richard Maud, kindly wrote for the Perth US Asia Center an assessment of the speech. What we're hoping for is that in the coming months, President Biden will do a similar speech on kind of the Asia Pacific region, trade, et cetera. And then we'd like to turn to the Washington side of the Asia Society Policy Institute to see if we might get your perspectives on that at that point then. So until then, thank you again for your time. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. And great to see you, Gordon.